In the vast skies of aviation history, some names shine brightly before fading into memory. My name is Jhon, and this is my channel Plan Here Said, where we revisit the stories of iconic aircraft and the tragedies that shaped the world's understanding of flight. Today, we look beyond the crashes themselves and into the fate of one of aviation's greatest giants, McDonnell Douglas, once a titan of the skies, building legendary aircraft like the DC-10 and the MD-80. The company seemed unstoppable. But what really happened to McDonnell Douglas? Why did such a powerful force in aviation history disappear? From the very beginning of aviation's golden age, McDonnell Douglas stood as a towering figure in the skies, a company born out of two pioneering legacies that came together to change the face of both commercial and military aviation. To understand its rise is to understand the story of ambition, innovation, and the unrelenting pursuit of power in the skies. McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, founded in 1939 by James S. McDonnell, quickly carved a place for itself in the world of military aviation, producing fighters that became household names during the Cold War. The F-4 Phantom Sekou, for example, was one of the most iconic jets of its time, dominating the skies during the Vietnam War and serving with multiple air forces around the globe. It was a machine of sheer speed, firepower, and versatility, and it gave McDonnell a reputation as a builder of aircraft that could deliver dominance. On the other side was the Douglas Aircraft Company, a name that was already legendary in the aviation industry. Founded by Donald Wills Douglas in 1921, this company gave the world the DC series of commercial airliners, most notably the DC-3, an aircraft so revolutionary that it reshaped air travel and still flies to this day in some parts of the world. During World War II, Douglas became a backbone of the Allied air fleet, producing thousands of aircraft that helped secure victory. The DC-3 itself was converted into the C-47 Skytrain, which carried troops and supplies into battle zones and became a lifeline for the war effort. After the war, Douglas continued to dominate with aircraft like the DC-4, DC-6, and the mighty DC-8, one of the first jet airliners that competed directly with Boeing's 707, showing that Douglas was a name that could never be overlooked. By the 1960s, McDonnell and Douglas were titans in their own right, one specializing in military might and the other in commercial dominance. But both were facing challenges. McDonnell needed access to the booming airliner market to diversify its portfolio beyond military contracts, while Douglas was struggling financially and organizationally, stretched too thin by the demands of producing both commercial and military aircraft at a massive scale. In 1967, the two giants merged to form McDonnell Douglas, and with that union came the promise of a new era in aviation history. The merger was seen as a marriage of strength. McDonnell's innovative military designs, combined with Douglas's proven experience in passenger aircraft. Together, they set out to compete with Boeing and Lockheed for dominance of the skies. The new company wasted no time in leaving its mark. One of its first great successes after the merger was the DC-10, a wide-body trijet introduced in 1970 aimed at revolutionizing long-haul travel. It promised airlines efficiency, comfort, and range, and for a time it was a serious competitor to the Lockheed L-1011 Tristar and Boeing 747. Though the DC-10 would later be remembered for safety controversies, it cannot be denied that its impact on commercial aviation was profound. Airlines around the world flew the DC-10, and it became a backbone for carriers like American Airlines, United Airlines, and even international giants such as KLM and Air France. Passengers who flew aboard these planes experienced the thrill of modern air travel, as McDonnell Douglas positioned itself as a true contender against Boeing's dominance. While commercial aviation was one side of the story, McDonnell Douglas continued its deep investment in military aviation, producing aircraft that shaped modern air forces. The F-15 Eagle, introduced in the 1970s, became one of the most successful fighter jets ever built, boasting a near-perfect combat record. The FK-18 Hornet followed, serving as a versatile fighter for both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, a testament to McDonnell Douglas's engineering brilliance. These aircraft were not just machines. They were symbols of power, speed, and technological progress that carried the McDonnell Douglas name into history books. Nations trusted their security to these jets, and the company's reputation grew with every successful deployment. Back in the civilian world, McDonnell Douglas continued to expand its portfolio. The DC-9 and its successor, the MD-80 series, became workhorses for airlines, particularly in the United States. These planes were reliable, efficient, and perfectly suited for short to medium-haul routes, serving millions of passengers over decades. If you ever flew on a narrow-body jet in the 1980s or 1990s in America, chances are you sat inside a McDonnell Douglas aircraft. The MD-80, with its distinctive T, tail and rear-mounted engines, became an icon of regional travel and remained in service for years, a sign of the durability and practicality of McDonnell Douglas designs. The rise of McDonnell Douglas was not just about products, but about its place in the broader story of aviation competition. For decades, it was Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Lockheed, the three giants of aerospace, fighting for contracts, dominance, and global recognition. Each company had its champions, and McDonnell Douglas, with its balanced approach to military and commercial aviation, seemed poised to stand tall indefinitely. Its designs were bold, its engineers innovative, and its aircraft recognizable to anyone who looked to the skies. By the 1980s, the company was one of the most respected names in aerospace. It had mastered the art of creating jets that combined efficiency with performance, delivering value to airlines and governments alike. Airports across the globe were filled with McDonnell Douglas aircraft, while militaries relied on its fighters to secure their borders. It seemed unthinkable that this powerhouse could ever fade away. For aviation enthusiasts, the McDonnell Douglas logo symbolized engineering brilliance, a proud heritage, and an ongoing legacy of shaping the very skies above us. Every time a DC-10 lifted off from a runway, every time an F-15 roared into the air, every time an MD-80 took passengers to their destinations, McDonnell Douglas wrote another line in the story of flight. Its aircraft were not just machines of metal and rivets. They were ambassadors of human progress, symbols of how far humanity had come in just a few decades since the Wright brothers. They stood as proof that imagination and ambition could lift entire nations into the sky. But behind this rise, beneath the triumphs and celebrated aircraft, the seeds of future struggles were quietly being sown. The competition was fierce, the industry unforgiving, and as powerful as McDonnell Douglas had become, the challenges it faced in the coming decades would test its ability to survive. Yet in this first chapter of its story, its rise remains one of aviation's most remarkable legacies. A tale of two companies merging their strengths to create a titan that soared into history. The success of McDonnell Douglas in the early decades after the merger painted a picture of dominance, but as the years progressed, the cracks in its foundation began to show. The same company that once stood shoulder to shoulder with Boeing, and Lockheed would slowly find itself overwhelmed by a storm of financial troubles, shifting market forces, and a series of decisions that would ultimately lead to its downfall. The story of McDonnell Douglas's decline is not just about business missteps, but about how even giants of innovation can be brought down by complacency, intense competition, and the relentless pace of change in the aviation industry. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the commercial aviation market had begun to transform dramatically. Boeing's 747 was already an established icon, carrying hundreds of passengers across oceans, while Airbus, a European consortium that many once dismissed, was rapidly rising as a competitor with its A300 and later the A320 family. Lockheed, which had competed with its TriStar, had already exited the commercial jetliner market, leaving Boeing, Airbus, and McDonnell Douglas as the big three. But unlike Boeing and Airbus, McDonnell Douglas was increasingly relying on older designs and stretched versions of existing aircraft rather than committing to bold, all-new airframes. The DC-10, though initially successful, became plagued with controversy after several high-profile accidents in the 1970s, most notably the Turkish Airlines crash near Paris in 1974 and the horrific crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago in 1979. While many of these tragedies were the result of maintenance practices or external factors, the DC-10's name was forever tainted in the eyes of the public. Passengers often whispered in fear when boarding one, and airlines had to work harder to reassure customers that the aircraft was safe. Although later versions of the DC-10 proved reliable and even beloved by many pilots, the damage to McDonnell Douglas's reputation was already done. As the 1980s progressed, McDonnell Douglas continued to market its DC-9 and MD-80 series, aircraft that were dependable but increasingly outdated compared to the fresh designs coming from Airbus and Boeing. The A320, introduced in 1988, ushered in the age of advanced fly-by-wire technology and fuel efficiency, offering airlines a modern aircraft that reduced operating costs significantly. Boeing countered with its hugely successful 737 Next Generation series, which built upon an already dominant platform. Meanwhile, McDonnell Douglas attempted to keep pace with incremental updates, stretching the MD-80 into the MD-90 and later proposing the MD-95, which would eventually become the Boeing 717 after the merger. These were solid aircraft, but they lacked the technological leap and global appeal of their competitors. The company was falling into a cycle of patching old designs rather than breaking new ground. And in a market that rewarded innovation, this conservatism was costly. Financial troubles compounded the challenges. McDonnell Douglas had always balanced its commercial and military divisions, but as its airliners struggled, it leaned more heavily on defense contracts. The Cold War had provided a steady stream of revenue through fighter jets like the F-15 and F-18, which secured McDonnell Douglas's position as a cornerstone of American military power. But as the Cold War wound down in the late 1980s and early 1990s, defense spending began to shrink, and the over-reliance on military contracts left the company vulnerable. Commercial aviation, where Boeing and Airbus were surging ahead, was where long-term survival required dominance, and McDonnell Douglas was slipping further behind with each passing year. One of the most telling examples of its struggle was the ill-fated MD-11 program, launched as the successor to the DC-10. The MD-11 promised airlines better efficiency, longer range, and modern avionics. But in reality, it suffered from performance shortfalls. Airlines like Singapore Airlines, which initially ordered the MD-11, cancelled or reduced their commitments when the aircraft failed to deliver the advertised fuel efficiency and range. Boeing's 747 and Airbus's A340 offered more reliable performance, and once again McDonnell Douglas found itself losing ground in the lucrative long-haul market. The MD-11 would find a second life as a freighter, loved by cargo carriers like FedEx and UPS, but it was far from the flagship McDonnell Douglas had hoped would revitalize its passenger aircraft reputation. Internally, management decisions were also criticized as short-sighted and overly cautious, rather than taking risks on bold new designs that could challenge Boeing and Airbus head-on. Leadership often chose the safer route of modifying existing models. This strategy may have saved money in the short term, but left the company with an aging product line in the long run. Innovation slowed, morale within the company suffered, and the once proud manufacturer seemed unable to regain its footing. By the 1990s, the aviation landscape was shifting decisively. Boeing had established dominance in both wide-body and narrow-body markets, and Airbus was gaining momentum with its A320 family, which airlines adored for its efficiency and passenger comfort. McDonnell Douglas was increasingly squeezed into a corner, with only a handful of commercial models still finding buyers. The MD-80 series hung on in North America, but globally demand was shrinking. The MD-90 and MD-95 were too little, too late. The MD-11 could not compete effectively against newer designs. The handwriting was on the wall. The company's fate was sealed when discussions began about merging with another aerospace giant. Initially, there were talks with other potential partners, but ultimately Boeing became the inevitable suitor. In 1997, Boeing and McDonnell Douglas completed a merger that effectively ended the independent existence of McDonnell Douglas. On paper, it was described as a merger, but in reality, it was an acquisition. Boeing was the stronger of the two companies, and it absorbed McDonnell Douglas entirely, retiring its name and folding its operations into the larger Boeing empire. For aviation enthusiasts and employees alike, it was the end of an era. A company that had built some of the most iconic aircraft in history, both civilian and military, disappeared from the skies almost overnight. The legacy of McDonnell Douglas did not vanish completely, however. Its aircraft continued to serve for years, with MD-80s flying passengers well into the 2010s and MD-11 freighters still operating cargo routes today. The FTA-18 Hornet and its derivatives continued to form the backbone of U.S. Navy aviation, and the Boeing 717, once the MD-95, became a small but significant player in regional travel. But the name McDonnell Douglas itself, once etched proudly on the tails of jets around the world, became a relic of history, remembered only by aviation enthusiasts, historians, and those who once worked within its walls. The story of McDonnell Douglas's decline is a cautionary tale. It shows how a company that once defined innovation and strength in both military and commercial aviation can falter if it fails to adapt to changing times. It is a reminder that in aviation, as in many industries, resting on past achievements is not enough. The skies are unforgiving, and only those willing to push the boundaries of technology and strategy can continue to soar. McDonnell Douglas rose to incredible heights, gave the world some of its most remarkable machines, but ultimately could not keep pace with the competition. Its end was not a fiery crash, but a slow descent, culminating in absorption by its greatest rival. And so, the story closes on McDonnell Douglas, a titan that once commanded the skies, now a memory preserved in the gleaming aluminum of aircraft museums and in the hearts of those who still look up whenever an MD-80 or MD-11 passes overhead. Its disappearance serves as both a tribute and a warning, a testament to greatness achieved and a reminder of how easily it can slip away. While the name may be gone, its legacy continues to echo through every takeoff, every landing, and every moment when humanity dares to rise above the earth, just as McDonnell Douglas once did so brilliantly.